The summons arrived at 600 station time, delivered by a full Veltharan honor guard wearing ceremonial armor that looked more decorative than functional. Lieutenant James Harding signed for it with the kind of bureaucratic detachment that came from 18 months of military liaison work. Most official communications turned out to be routine protocol dressed up in formal language. Then he read it. Lieutenant James Harding, Human Coalition Forces, you are hereby summoned to appear before the High Tribunal of the Veltharan Matriarchy at 1400 station time today. Your presence is required for a matter of significant importance to Veltharan human relations. Formal dress required. This summons carries legal authority under Article 7 of the Alliance Treaty. James read it 3 times, searching for context clues. The High Tribunal rarely dealt with individual liaison officers. They set policy, adjudicated major disputes, and made decisions that affected entire populations. Whatever this was about, it was beyond his normal duties. He arrived at the tribunal chamber in full dress uniform, uncomfortable in the formal attire but aware that Veltharans took ceremony seriously. The chamber itself was impressive, circular, with high ceilings that made voices echo, and 7 elevated seats arranged in a semicircle where the tribunal members sat in judgment. But it wasn't the architecture that made James's stomach drop. It was the crowd. The chamber was packed. Dozens of Veltharan females, their distinctive long ears adorned with the elaborate jewelry that marked rank and status, filled the witness galleries. Medical personnel stood along one wall. Legal advocates clustered near the tribunal seats. And most disturbing, 20 young Veltharan females stood in a separate group to the left of the tribunal, all wearing identical ceremonial robes, all watching him with expressions he couldn't quite parse. High Matriarch Ceres, the eldest tribunal member with silver hair and ear ornaments so elaborate they must have weighed pounds, rose to speak. The chamber fell silent immediately. Lieutenant James Harding of the Human Coalition Forces, you stand before this tribunal on a matter of profound importance to the Veltharan people. We thank you for your service as military liaison and for your contributions to the alliance between our peoples. Her voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings. You have been selected to fulfill a sacred duty, one that may preserve our species from extinction. James felt his pulse quicken. The formal language, the crowd, the ceremonial atmosphere, this was building toward something significant, and every instinct he had was screaming warnings. Ceres continued, our species faces an existential crisis. For 3 generations, our birth rate has fallen below sustainable levels. Genetic analysis has revealed dangerous levels of inbreeding within our limited population. Without intervention, we face extinction within 5 to 7 generations. James knew about the Veltharan population crisis. It was mentioned in cultural briefings, discussed obliquely in diplomatic contexts. But the Veltharans were intensely private about reproductive matters. He'd never heard it described so bluntly. Extensive research has confirmed genetic compatibility between humans and Veltharans, Ceres said. Hybrid offspring are not only possible but show enhanced genetic diversity that could strengthen our population significantly. Therefore, after careful evaluation, you have been selected to participate in our continuation rite. She gestured to the 20 young females in ceremonial robes. These daughters have reached breeding maturity within the past lunar cycle. They have been honored with selection to participate in the rite. You will provide genetic material and, if willing, direct participation in conception over the next 10 days, in accordance with our sacred traditions. The words hit James like a physical blow. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing, rejecting it even as understanding crystallized with horrible clarity. You have been chosen, Ceres continued, through evaluation of genetic compatibility, psychological assessment, and review of your service record. This is not merely a request, Lieutenant. Under Article 7 of the Alliance Treaty, specifically, the mutual assistance clause regarding existential threats. This constitutes a legal duty. You will be compensated according to established protocols, granted honorary status within Veltharan society, and recognized for your service to our species' survival. James found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. High Matriarch, I need clarification. You're ordering me to, he couldn't quite say it, to participate in conception with these 20 women. Duty requires you to help preserve our species, yes. The rite has been prepared according to our traditions. Medical personnel will ensure optimal conditions for conception. The daughters have been educated in their sacred role. All protocols have been established to honor both our customs and your physical needs. James looked at the 20 young females again. They were all watching him, and now he could read their expressions better: resignation, nervousness, a few showing what might be fear beneath dutiful acceptance. They looked young, so damn young, even accounting for different species maturation rates. What about them? James asked, his voice sharper than diplomatic protocol suggested was wise. What about their choice in this? Saras's expression shifted to confusion, like he'd asked why water was wet. They have been honored with selection for this sacred duty. Their families take pride in their participation. They understand the importance of their role in preserving our species. But did anyone ask them what they want? Did anyone give them the option to refuse? The tribunal members exchanged glances that suggested his question made no sense to them. Another matriarch, younger, with dark hair and fewer ornaments, spoke up. Lieutenant, they are of breeding age. They are fertile and genetically suitable. They are honored to serve their people's survival. What choice is there when duty is clear? The choice to say no, James said, and something solidified in his chest. A line he wouldn't cross regardless of political consequences or treaty obligations. The choice to decide what happens to their own bodies. Saras leaned forward. Lieutenant, perhaps you misunderstand. This is not punishment or harm. This is sacred duty, carefully prepared and honored. These daughters will be celebrated for their contribution to our future. You will be treated with respect and gratitude. What you call choice is irrelevant when the need is existential and the path is clear. Choice is never irrelevant, James said firmly. High Matriarch, members of the tribunal, I understand your people are facing a crisis. That's real, and I sympathize with it genuinely. But what you're proposing violates fundamental human ethics. You're asking me to participate in something that treats these women as means to an end rather than as people with their own agency and desires. I can't do that. I won't. The chamber erupted in whispers. Several tribunal members looked genuinely shocked, as if he'd just committed blasphemy. The witnesses in the galleries began talking among themselves, and the medical personnel near the wall looked confused. You would refuse to help save our species? A third tribunal member asked, her voice sharp with anger. When we have been allies, when we have fought beside your people, when we ask for this one service that costs you only time and genetic material. It costs more than that, James said. It costs my integrity, and more importantly, it costs those 20 women their right to choose what happens with their own bodies. That's not a price I'm willing to pay, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. He took a breath, trying to organize thoughts that were moving too fast. But I'm not refusing to help. I'm refusing to help this way. If you want to address your population crisis, I'll work with you to find solutions that don't require treating people as breeding resources. Genetic banks, reproductive technology, off-world population exchanges. There are alternatives that preserve both your species and your ethics. You presume to tell us how to preserve our own people. Saras's voice held warning. I'm telling you that I can't participate in something that violates the principles I believe define what makes us better than our worst instincts. Survival at any cost isn't actually survival. It's just prolonging existence while sacrificing what made life worth living in the first place. The silence that followed was heavy enough to be physical. James stood at attention, knowing he just potentially destroyed his career and triggered a diplomatic crisis, but unable to regret the words. Finally, High Matriarch Saris spoke. "The tribunal will deliberate. You will remain available for further proceedings." Dismissed. As guards escorted James from the chamber, he caught one last glimpse of the 20 young females in ceremonial robes. Several were staring at him with expressions of confusion. One looked like she might cry. Another, dark-haired, with eyes that reminded him painfully of his younger sister, mouthed 2 words he almost missed. James spent the next 3 hours under guard in a waiting chamber, not imprisoned exactly, but definitely not free to leave. He used the time to contact his command through secure channels, explaining the situation with as much diplomatic neutrality as he could manage, while describing what was essentially a demand that he participate in state-sanctioned reproductive coercion. His commanding officer's response was about as helpful as expected. "Lieutenant, we acknowledge your objection and appreciate your ethical concerns. However, the Alliance Treaty does include mutual assistance clauses that the Veltharans are interpreting as applicable here. We're consulting with legal and diplomatic teams, but we need to move carefully. The alliance with the Veltharan Matriarchy is strategically important. Don't make this a crisis if it doesn't have to be." In other words, one human's discomfort versus an alliance that mattered to Earth's position in this region of space. The political calculus was clear, and James knew exactly where he ranked in that equation. When the tribunal reconvened, the chamber was less crowded. The general witnesses had been dismissed, leaving only the tribunal members, the 20 young females, medical personnel, and legal advocates. High Matriarch Saris looked older somehow, more tired. "Lieutenant Harding, we have debated your objection extensively. We consulted our own legal experts, reviewed human ethical frameworks, and discussed the implications of forcing your participation against your stated principles." She paused, and something that might have been respect crossed her ancient face. "We do not fully understand your reasoning. Our culture has different values regarding individual choice versus collective survival. But we recognize that compelling you would damage the alliance we value." James felt a small measure of relief, quickly tempered by Saris's next words. "Therefore, we propose a compromise. You have expressed concern about the daughter's lack of choice. We find this concept strange. They have been honored with selection, they understand their duty, and their families support their participation. But we will accommodate your human values to the extent possible." She gestured to the 20 females. "You will meet with each daughter individually. You will explain your concerns about consent and choice. You will ensure they understand that participation is voluntary according to human ethics. If, after these conversations, they still wish to fulfill their duty to our species, will you honor their informed choice?" It was a trap of sorts. James understood that immediately. These women had been raised in a culture that prized collective duty over individual desire. They'd been prepared for this role, told it was an honor, surrounded by social pressure that made refusal nearly unthinkable. How could they choose freely when their entire society was telling them what that choice should be? But then he looked at their faces again, really looked, and saw something he'd missed before: curiosity. Several of the women were watching him with an expression that suggested they'd never heard someone question their duty before, and the possibility was both frightening and intriguing. "I have conditions," James said carefully. "Private conversations with each woman, no family members or authority figures present. Access to information about alternatives to this right, including technological solutions and other options. An absolute guarantee that any woman who chooses not to participate faces no punishment, social consequences, or loss of status. If you can't promise that, then this isn't really choice." The tribunal members conferred in their own language for several minutes. Finally, Saris nodded. "Your conditions are acceptable, but Lieutenant, Understand that we expect most, if not all, will choose to fulfill their duty once you explain your concerns. Our daughters understand what is at stake. Then they'll choose, and I'll respect that choice, but it has to be real. Over the next 2 days, James met individually with each of the 20 females. The meetings took place in a neutral room with recording equipment, at his insistence, so there could be no question later about what was discussed. A Veltharan translator was present for any language difficulties, though most of the young women spoke passable standard. The first conversation set the pattern for many that followed. The woman, introduced as Lissa, sat across from James with the careful posture of someone who'd been trained in formal protocols. She looked maybe 20 in human years, though Veltharan aging didn't quite match human patterns. "Lissa," James began, "I want to explain why I objected to the tribunal's order. In human culture, we have a concept called bodily autonomy. It means that your body belongs to you and no one, no government, no authority, no duty, can tell you what to do with it without your consent." Lissa's brow furrowed. "But the right is my duty. How can I consent to what is already required?" That's exactly the problem. Duty that's required isn't really duty, it's coercion. Real duty, the kind that has meaning, requires the freedom to choose it or not choose it. "But our species is dying," Lissa said, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "If we all choose not to fulfill our duty, we go extinct. How is that better?" "I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying that survival achieved through forcing people to do things against their will isn't actually survival worth achieving. There are other ways: technological solutions, voluntary genetic donation, cooperation with off-world populations. Ways that don't require you to do anything with your body that you don't freely choose. So I can refuse." The question came out tentatively, like she was testing whether saying the words would trigger punishment. "Yes, absolutely. And if anyone tries to punish you for that choice, they'll have to answer to me and the human diplomatic corps." Lissa was quiet for a long time, processing. "No one has ever told me I could refuse before. They said this was an honor, that I should be grateful, that my family's status depended on my participation." "Your family's status shouldn't depend on what you do with your body. That's not honor, that's blackmail." Tears formed in Lissa's eyes. "I've been terrified for weeks, but everyone kept telling me I was supposed to feel honored, so I thought something was wrong with me. You're saying it's okay to be scared, to not want this. It's more than okay. It's completely normal and valid. You're allowed to have feelings about what happens to you, and those feelings matter." By the end of their conversation, Lissa had chosen to decline participation. She left the room looking both relieved and frightened about what that choice might cost her. The second woman, Chiara, responded differently. She listened to James's explanation of consent and autonomy with growing anger, not at him, but at the system that had never offered her these concepts before. "You're telling me that I could have said no all along? That all this preparation, all this pressure from my family, all the ceremonies and honors, I could have just refused?" "You could have, you should have been able to. The fact that no one told you that is wrong." Chiara stood and paced the small room. "Do you know what they did to prepare us? Medical examinations that were invasive and humiliating. Psychological conditioning about our duty to the species. Classes on how to be attractive to human males, how to optimize conception chances, how to suppress our own discomfort for the greater good." Her voice broke. "And no one ever asked if we wanted any of it. I'm sorry that happened to you. It was wrong, all of it. So what happens if I refuse? Really, what are the actual consequences?" "According to the agreement I made with the tribunal, there should be none. But I'll be honest, your society might try to pressure you anyway. Your family might be disappointed. People might judge you. I can't prevent all of that. What I can do is make sure there are no official punishments, and I can help connect you with support systems and alternative options." Chiara chose to decline as well, though James could see the weight of that decision in her face. the knowledge that she was choosing herself over social expectations, and that choice would have costs even if they weren't official. Not all the conversations went the same way. The third woman, Vila, listened carefully to everything James said about choice and autonomy, then told him firmly that she still wanted to participate. "I understand what you're saying about consent," she said, "and I appreciate that you're giving me the choice, but I choose to participate, not because it's my duty, because I believe it's right. Our species is dying and I want to be part of the solution. That's my choice, freely made. You understand you can change your mind at any time, that even if you say yes now, you can say no later." "I understand, and I choose yes." James respected that choice, though it made him deeply uncomfortable. But that was the point of consent. It meant respecting decisions that went both ways, even when you didn't like one of those directions. By the end of the 2 days, the numbers were clear. 5 women had chosen to participate in the rite after understanding their alternatives and rights. 15 had chosen to decline. James reported these results to the tribunal, along with his recommendation that the 15 who declined be connected with human reproductive specialists to explore other options. Genetic donation without direct participation, surrogacy arrangements with human volunteers who freely chose that role, advanced fertility treatments that might help address underlying causes of Veltharan population decline. The tribunal's reaction was immediate and angry. 5. High Matriarch Ceres's voice shook with fury. Out of 20 carefully selected daughters, only 5 choose to fulfill their duty. The tribunal called a recess, and James was again confined to the waiting chamber while they deliberated. This time, the wait stretched to 5 hours. He spent the time reviewing messages from his command, who were notably less supportive now that the diplomatic incident was fully developed, and from human reproductive specialists who'd seen his initial reports and were offering assistance with alternative solutions. When he was summoned back, the chamber felt different. The 20 young women were gone, but new people had arrived. What looked like medical researchers, genetic specialists, and several older Veltharan females who wore the ornaments of clan mothers. High Matriarch Ceres looked like she'd aged a decade in 5 hours. "Lieutenant Harding, we have reviewed your actions and their implications extensively. What you call giving them choice, we call undermining cultural duty. What you call respecting autonomy, we call threatening our species' survival. We are at an impasse regarding interpretation." James stayed silent, letting her continue. "However," Ceres said, and her voice carried the weight of reluctant admission, "we have also been forced to confront questions we have avoided for too long. Specifically, why did so many of our daughters choose to refuse when given the option? What does that say about the methods we have used to address our population crisis?" She gestured to the clan mothers who joined them. "These honored elders have reminded us that our ancestors valued wisdom and considered choice, not just duty. That the decline of our population may be linked not just to genetics, but to practices that make bearing children seem like obligation rather than joy. That survival achieved by compelling our daughters to serve as breeding resources may not be survival worth achieving." The words were almost exactly what James had said earlier, now coming from Veltharan mouths in Veltharan cultural terms. He felt something ease in his chest, not victory exactly, but recognition that understanding was possible. "Your words have caused deep discomfort," Ceres continued, "but discomfort may be necessary. Therefore, we propose a new approach, one that attempts to balance species survival with these concepts of choice and autonomy you have introduced." She pulled up a holographic display showing genetic data, population projections, and technological capabilities. "We have consulted with our medical researchers and your human reproductive specialists. There are alternatives to the rite as we have traditionally practiced it. Genetic diversity can be enhanced through donated material rather than direct conception. Fertility treatments can be offered voluntarily to those who wish to bear children. Surrogacy arrangements can be made with willing participants from both our species and yours. These alternatives are more complex, more expensive, and slower than our traditional approach, another tribunal member added. But they appear to achieve similar genetic benefits while respecting individual autonomy. If we can convince our daughters to participate voluntarily in these alternatives, would that satisfy your ethical concerns? If participation is genuinely voluntary, with full information, real alternatives, and no coercion, then yes, James said. But the voluntary part has to be real, not duty dressed up as choice. The following weeks were exhausting and complex. James worked with human reproductive specialists and open-minded Veltharan medical researchers to develop a comprehensive program that addressed the population crisis without coercing participation. They established genetic donation clinics where Veltharans could voluntarily contribute material, matched with human donors who'd freely chosen to participate. They developed fertility treatment programs that gave Veltharan women more control over their own reproductive choices. They created educational materials about consent, bodily autonomy, and the difference between duty chosen and duty imposed. The 15 women who declined participation in the original Rite became, unexpectedly, the program's most valuable advocates. Chiara, the woman who'd been so angry about the invasive preparation she'd undergone, channeled that anger into activism, speaking publicly about her experience, educating other young Veltharans about their right to choose, challenging cultural assumptions about duty and obligation. "The tribunal told us we should be honored," she said in one public address that James attended. "But you cannot honor someone while simultaneously denying them choice. The lieutenant from Earth taught us that real honor requires autonomy, that our worth comes from who we are, not from what we can do for species survival. This is a hard lesson for our culture, but it is a necessary one." The 5 who had chosen to participate, including Vila, who'd firmly asserted her choice to be part of the solution, also played important roles. They demonstrated that voluntary participation was possible, that informed consent didn't mean everyone would refuse, that respecting autonomy meant respecting all choices, including the choice to help. 3 months after the initial tribunal summons, James sat in a planning meeting with Veltharan medical researchers, human specialists, and representatives from several Veltharan clans. They were reviewing preliminary data on the new program's effectiveness. "Genetic diversity markers are improving," a Veltharan researcher reported. "Voluntary participation in genetic donation programs has exceeded our initial projections. And perhaps most significantly, we're seeing increased interest among young Veltharans in bearing children, not because it's their duty, but because they're choosing it." A clan mother spoke up, her aged voice carrying authority. "We have suppressed an uncomfortable truth for generations. Our birth rate declined not just because of genetic problems, but because we made bearing children seem like obligation rather than joy. We pressured our daughters, controlled their choices, treated them as resources rather than people. And they responded by choosing, wherever possible, not to participate in perpetuating a system that treated them thus." "You're saying the population crisis was partially self-inflicted," James observed. "Partially, yes. The genetic issues are real, but the social issues compounded them. By treating reproduction as compulsory duty, we made it undesirable. Your refusal to participate in that system has forced us to confront this. Not everyone supported the changes. Many Veltharans, especially older traditionalists, argued that species survival required sacrifice, and that these new concepts of choice and autonomy were human cultural imperialism, undermining Veltharan values. There were protests, political opposition, and attempts to reinstate the traditional Rite. But gradually, something shifted. The younger Veltharans who'd been raised under the old system but were now experiencing the new approach became its strongest advocates. They spoke about the difference between being told you were honored and actually feeling honored, between duty imposed and purpose chosen. James found himself in an unexpected role, not as a participant in the continuation Rite as originally demanded, but as an advisor helping reshape how the Veltharan Matriarchy approached its existential crisis. He worked with cultural educators to develop materials about consent that made sense within Veltharan cultural context. He trained tribunal members on how to distinguish between voluntary and coerced participation. He connected Veltharan advocates with human ethicists who could provide frameworks for balancing collective survival with individual rights. 6 months after the initial summons, James met again with Chiara, who'd become one of the most prominent voices in the reproductive rights movement that had emerged from the crisis. The tribunal announced yesterday that they're formally revising the continuation right, she told him, her eyes bright with satisfaction. All participation will be voluntary, with informed consent required and verified. Alternatives will be provided for those who choose not to participate directly. And most importantly, refusal will carry no social or legal penalties. That's a significant victory, James said. It's your victory. You could have just complied, participated without question, kept the alliance happy and the tribunal satisfied. Instead, you risked your career and a diplomatic crisis because you believed our choices mattered. That changed everything. It wasn't my victory alone. You and the others who found the courage to choose differently, you're the ones who made this real. I just gave you permission to do what you already wanted. Permission matters, Chiara said firmly, especially when everyone else is telling you that wanting something different is wrong. You gave us that permission, and we'll never forget it. 2 years after the initial tribunal summons, James stood before the High Tribunal again. This time, the context was completely different. He was receiving formal recognition for his contributions to Veltharan society, though the irony of being honored for refusing to do what they'd originally ordered wasn't lost on anyone. High Matriarch Saris, looking older but somehow less burdened, addressed the assembled witnesses. Lieutenant James Harding, you came before this tribunal as one ordered to fulfill a duty. You refused us. You challenged our authority and our traditions. You forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we had been treating our own daughters in the name of species survival. She paused, and something like a smile crossed her ancient face. You were right, and we were wrong. Our population crisis remains, but now we address it with methods that honor both survival and dignity. Our daughters choose participation rather than having it imposed. Our birth rate has begun to stabilize not through coercion, but through making bearing children something worth choosing. The recognition ceremony included testimony from the 20 women who'd been part of the original Rite, both the 5 who'd chosen to participate and the 15 who'd declined. They spoke about how that moment of being offered real choice had changed their understanding of themselves and their society. Vila, who'd chosen to participate and had successfully borne a hybrid child, spoke about the difference between duty and choice. When I participated in the Rite, it was my decision. That made everything different, not easier necessarily, but meaningful. I did not do it because I was told I must, but because I believed it was right. That distinction matters more than the tribunal understood when they first summoned the lieutenant. Chiara, now a prominent advocate and policy advisor, addressed the tension between individual rights and collective survival. We were told that choice was a luxury we couldn't afford during an existential crisis. The lieutenant taught us that choice is actually essential to surviving such a crisis with our values intact. Survival without ethics is just postponing death, while becoming something not worth preserving. After the ceremony, James had a private meeting with High Matriarch Saris. The elder matriarch had been his primary opponent during the initial crisis, but their relationship had evolved into something more complex over the past 2 years. I owe you an apology, Saris said without preamble. When you first refused our order, I thought you were simply being difficult, imposing human values on Veltharan culture without understanding our desperation. I was wrong. You were trying to save your people, James said. That's not something that requires apology. The methods I endorsed required apology. The assumptions I made about duty and obligation and what we could demand from our daughters, those were wrong. She paused, her aged face showing the weight of leadership and regret. We told ourselves that survival justified any measure, that the end of preserving our species meant any means were acceptable. You showed us that some means destroy what we're trying to preserve. I didn't mean to cause a cultural crisis, James admitted. I just couldn't participate in something that felt fundamentally wrong. Your discomfort was wiser than our certainty. That is a hard lesson for leaders to learn, that sometimes the outsider who objects sees more clearly than we who are immersed in our traditions. Saris gestured to a display showing population data. The crisis is not solved, Lieutenant. We have years of work ahead, but now we approach it as a society that values our daughters as people, not resources. That change came from your refusal to accept our original answer. The change came from your daughters finding their voices, James corrected. I just opened a door. They walked through it. 3 years after the crisis, the reforms had become normalized enough that new challenges emerged. How to handle Veltharans who wanted to voluntarily participate in genetic diversity programs, but faced cultural pressure from traditionalists who saw them as betraying their species by choosing human partnership. The ethical complications ran in multiple directions, requiring constant negotiation and reassessment. James found himself consulting on these new dilemmas, working with Veltharan ethicists and human cultural specialists to develop frameworks that respected both autonomy and cultural values. The work was never finished, never simple, but it was meaningful in ways his original liaison duties had never been. 5 years later, the Veltharan population had stabilized. The birth rate, while still below ideal levels, had stopped declining. Genetic diversity had improved significantly through voluntary programs. And perhaps most importantly, young Veltharans grew up knowing they had choices about their own bodies and futures. The cultural shift rippled beyond reproduction into other areas of Veltharan society. Questions about duty versus choice, collective survival versus individual rights, traditional authority versus personal autonomy, all were being re-examined in light of the precedent established during the continuation Rite crisis. James received a message from Kiara, now serving as an advisor to the High Tribunal on reproductive rights and cultural reform. The matriarch who opposed you most strongly during the initial crisis passed away yesterday. In her final testament, she wrote that her greatest regret was not recognizing sooner that preserving our species meant more than just producing offspring. It meant building a society where our daughters chose to bring children into a world worth inheriting. She credited you with teaching her that lesson, thought you should know. 10 years after the initial summons, James prepared to end his extended deployment on Velthara Prime and return to Earth. His farewell reception was attended by hundreds of Veltharans whose lives had been touched by the reforms that emerged from one human's refusal to comply with orders he believed were wrong. The 20 women who'd been part of the original Rite were all present, now in their 30s, having lived the decade that followed through very different paths. The 5 who'd chosen to participate had borne children, started families, and demonstrated that voluntary participation was viable. The 15 who declined had pursued careers, educations, and lives they chose for themselves without the shadow of imposed duty. High Matriarch Saris, now ancient and near the end of her life, addressed James one final time in public. When you refused us, Lieutenant, I thought you did not understand the gravity of our situation. I was wrong. You understood it better than we did. You understood that how we survived mattered as much as whether we survived. You gave us a future worth choosing, not just a future of continued existence. For that, You have our eternal gratitude and respect." As James prepared to board the transport that would take him off-world, Kiara approached with a gift, a book containing testimonials from hundreds of young Veltharans who'd grown up in the Reformed society. "We wanted you to know what you changed," she said. "Not just the policies or the programs, but the fundamental understanding that our choices matter, that we're people with agency, not resources to be allocated by authority. That duty chosen is stronger than duty imposed. These are lessons we'll teach our own daughters and they'll teach theirs. You changed our culture, Lieutenant, forever." James accepted the book with genuine humility. "I just refused to do something that felt wrong. You and the others did the hard work of building something better." "Sometimes refusing is the hardest work," Kiara said, "especially when everyone is telling you that compliance is easier, necessary, justified by crisis. You showed us that some things are worth refusing, even at great personal cost. That lesson matters more than any policy change." Years later, the story of the human who refused the tribunal became cultural legend in Veltharan society, taught to young people as an example of moral courage, discussed in ethics classes, held up as a moment when one person's principles changed an entire civilization's trajectory. And for James Harding, who'd wanted nothing more than to complete his liaison assignment without incident, the experience became the defining moment of his career and his life. Proof that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to participate in systems you believe are wrong, even when refusal comes at significant cost. The story of one human saying no to authority, of offering alternatives that preserved dignity, of challenging an entire civilization to confront the limits of tradition and the cost of survival without ethics. The story of how empathy and principle, applied firmly but without violence, can redefine ancient customs and prove that human morality, properly understood and respectfully applied, can bridge cultural divides and help others find better ways forward. Not through domination or force, but through the simple, radical act of insisting that consent matters. That choice is essential. That survival achieved by sacrificing fundamental values isn't actually worth achieving at all.